welcome on behalf of MITRE and the Special Competitive Studies Project, the SCSP. This is a timely event. We struggled with the name, but we did come up with new public-private models for technology competitiveness and building Horizon Network for democracies. And we packed a lot in there, but we were very intentional with that as well. MITRE and SCSP have been working together in various ways nearly from the beginning of SCSP, and today's co-hosted event reflects an enduring collaboration between our two missionally aligned organizations. And it's going to be my pleasure now to introduce Cedric Sims. Cedric, you join me. Dr. Cedric Sims is Senior Vice President of Enterprise Innovation and Integration at MITRE. In this role, he leverages MITRE's technology, processes, and people to advance an environment of critical innovation, integration, creativity, and growth. Dr. Sims' commitment to living the mission and deep experience in homeland security accelerates innovation by leveraging partnerships across public and private sectors, work that is critical in ensuring the safety, security, and well-being of our nation. Let's welcome Cedric.
Well, thank you all for joining us today, and I want to wish everyone a very happy new year. It's great that we're starting out 2023 with this session, but I want to highlight something that's interesting. This is a new year, but there are a number of things about this that are not new. I want to go and look at a couple of the challenges that are before the Special Competitive Studies Project. They include the generational trial that we have, that 2025 to 2030 is a critical window. That has fundamentally not changed. If we look at the constellation of technologies that are transforming our world, that has fundamentally not changed. If we look at the geopolitical rivalry that we see between China and Russia and the challenges that we see with the United States, that has not changed. If we talk about what we value in terms of competition and the challenges that are with competition, as well as the challenges that democracies are facing with respect to technology and its impact on our culture, that has not changed. But what has changed is we've had a year of progress with this great organization, the contributions that each of you have made. And this is a great opportunity to come together and have some strategic discussions about how we take advantage of that and move this challenge forward. Maybe we can get to the end of 2023 and talk about what has in fact changed through the partnership that we all have working together. I want to thank each of you for the phenomenal time that you're going to spend together today, for the contributions you all are making, both intellectually and your commitment to our nation and our welfare and our progress. I also want to let you know that MITRE has a commitment to continue to work and to create this space of collaboration with you and work through these challenges going forward. With that, I'd like to hand the mic back over to PJ McKish, and thank you very much for all of your participation today.
Cedric, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody at MITRE for hosting us today and the partnership we've enjoyed. Good afternoon to everybody and welcome. Thank you so much for making time to be here today. As Cedric said, we really want to make this day count. The reasons we want to do this is that the stakes are not small in the international competition. And so at some point, I'd like to review that just very briefly to make sure that we all feel the significance of the day and the purpose. Technology strategy begins with horizon scanning, and it's not a simple endeavor. We need to know, where is the U.S. innovation ecosystem sufficient? Where does it need a nudge? What are the technologies that are ready? What are the technologies that we don't care if they're ready because we need to make them ready? Which ones are commercially viable? Which ones need more time to be commercially viable? By the way, where is the rival on these strategic technologies? Who's doing the comparative analysis? Who has the data? These are the kinds of questions that have to be answered when we're doing horizon scanning. And in short, it's not for the weak. It's an endeavor that requires our best minds. And that's really the purpose of today. The purpose of today is to build this what would a Horizon network look like if all of our best minds in the country across sector were connected in a public-private model that informed routinely and systematically the nations about where to go and what moves to make in technology. For those that we've not had an opportunity to engage with, the Special Competitive Studies Project has two histories. The far history is 56 to 59. Rockefeller hired Kissinger out of Harvard pre-Sputnik to help the nation prepare for the competition it was about to face. Again, pre-Sputnik, the question was, how do we organize for this competition? Henry Kissinger and Eric Schmidt had developed a friendship, had written books together, and were thinking about reloading that project for the current era. At the same time, the National Security Commission on AI, where Eric was the chair, was led by a patriot named Ili Bayraktari, who grew up in DoD, but also served as chief of staff in the White House to the National Security Advisor. He led the AI Commission, and Eric thought, I knew the person for this job. And so the near history was taking the effort of the AI Commission, but broadening it to all categories and of all technology. So that's the near and the far history, and the purpose of the project is to make sure the United States is positioned and organized to win this competition in this decade. For those, when we say the stakes are not large, just very briefly, some of you in the audience, and it's good to see some friends here, are China experts. But as a reminder, the two largest economies in the world are clashing right now. As they do that, they have very different ideologies. And so in our mid-decade challenges report, we note that there are three futures that are on the line in this decade, to include the future of geopolitics itself, the future of democracy, and the future of strategic technologies. It just so happens that China plays a role in all three of those futures, and therefore it's worth thinking about the competition factors, such as they have mega projects in strategic technologies, which means, as some here will know well, this is a whole of nation effort. When a mega project is declared in the PRC, it means all hands on deck. There are no questions asked. It is a routine, methodical process to, in essence, hit moons, if you will. And those mega projects have been longstanding and noteworthy in Christian Brose's work on the kill chain. Some of those projects are aimed specifically at the United States, and in this case that Chris talks about, directly at dismantling the US military in combat. Those plans are invested. So reasonable people may disagree about the level of investment in the PRC in this competition, but no one debates that the level of investment is substantial. They are not just plans, they are investable plans. Some of the accomplishments that China has already achieved are not low tech. To have a hypersonic glide boost vehicle travel approximately 12 minutes from China to the United States, destination unknown, with the ability to maneuver, and we're not even sure you could tell the President of the United States where it's going to hit, is not a low tech endeavor. I'm not even talking about the delivery vehicles. The missiles themselves are not a low tech endeavor, and they are there. And DoD officials have said that China outstrips the United States in number, type, and quality of hypersonics. 40% of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party has S&T degrees. They are learned and literate in this game and in this competition. They have a broad tech sphere of influence, which we've reported on, but everywhere from supply chains to global strategic communication structures like Huawei 5G to the Belt and Road Initiative, their spheres of influence cumulatively have grown to the point that it is safe to say there is no technology hegemon in the world today. Finally, China is in this to win and have organized to do that. So the 2017 laws that created MILSIV fusion, the move to merge space, cyber, and electronic warfare into one glorious organization called the SSF, and other moves to mimic innovation organizations in the US are all simply concluding that it's safe to say we're being out-organized. So the purpose of today, as we go into our first panel session, is to think about how would the United States organize, and specifically on bringing all the intellectual capital together to know what moves it should make. So it's my pleasure to introduce our two first leaders to kick us off on thinking about that and setting the stage for us today, Nadia Shadlow and Chris Ford. Nadia Shadlow is a strategist and practitioner of national security. She served in leadership positions in government and in the private sector. She's famous with us for her role in the National Security Council and Strat Plans, for taking what we consider a waypoint of waking up the United States in the 2017 National Security Strategy, which was a reorientation in the field to what the United States as a nation needed to prepare for and think about. In addition to that, she was the first one, really since the end of the Cold War, to kind of talk about that great power competition was back, and she gave us a discourse to think about that. Nadia is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. And here at MITRE, she's a senior visiting fellow and on our SCSP Board of Advisors, so she knits it all together. Nadia, great to have you. Chris Ford is a MITRE fellow, director of MITRE's Center for Strategic Competition, which was such a great idea to establish as an organization. It applies interdisciplinary, cross-functional, systems-informed analyses to national security challenges for the strategic competition. Before coming to MITRE, he served as a U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Nonproliferation, also fulfilling the responsibilities of the Undersecretary of Arms Control and International Security. Prior to the State Department, Chris was Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Weapons of Mass Destruction and Counterproliferation at the NSC. A former intelligence officer and in the Navy Reserve and a senior staffer of 5 different Senate committees, he also has served as a U.S. Special Representative for Nuclear Nonproliferation and as a Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. So will you all please welcome Nadia and Chris.
Thanks, PJ. Thanks so much for that nice introduction, PJ. Pleasure to be here this afternoon with my former colleague, Chris Ford. You can't really beat Chris's title, right? Special Assistant to the President for Weapons of Mass Destruction. That's a good title.
Generally against
Alarming.
them, although it was also some care and feeding of ours. But no, it's such a pleasure, of course, for me as well to be here with my colleague Nadia, with whom I've worked not only here in dribs and drabs at MITRE in the last couple of years, but of course at the NSC, as mentioned. Just what a fantastic opportunity for conversation and such an important topic. By way of framing points, I guess, if you don't mind, we could perhaps offer some things to kind of provide a orientation for some of the discussions that will follow. The panels will be dealing with a number of very specific questions that are related to the organizational challenges that PJ was talking about as we try to get our country together for strategic competition in a really effective way in this technology arena. But I thought I'd offer a couple of two quick points, and if you don't mind, then turn to you for anything you'd like to offer by way of framing before we get into more of a conversation, I suppose. The first point that I'd like to make is to point out that the SCSP has said some really important things about how technology competition needs to be understood as an aspect of, and with very important implications for, geopolitics. This is about competitive strategy through the lens of technology. It's not about technology per se, nor is it about strategy per se. It's this sort of interesting admixture of the two, and I think that's really important to bear in mind. As PJ mentioned, and as Cedric mentioned as well, this is, I think in the SCSP's phrase, a contest for the future over to what extent will China be able to use its aspirations and its efforts toward technology leadership in order to claim a geopolitical position for itself that in many ways would be very detrimental, not only to our interest, but to those of any country worldwide that wishes to safeguard its political autonomy and independence and to avoid incorporation into kind of a Sino-centric hegemony. So that's the important framing. Like, this is fundamentally, although we are talking about technology, we are talking about geopolitics as well in the same breath. And the second point is that to keep in mind that and the reports from the SASP are also very clear on this, that the answer to this challenge of strategic technology competition will require considerable attention to a much broader range of issues than just technology. It will require attention to issues of what some of us at MITRE have occasionally referred to as the techno system. That is the sort of the broader policy, legal, regulatory, sociological, political, organizational, behavioral system into which technology fits. And that's really, really important, I think, to keep in mind as well. I think it's General Omar Bradley is reputed to have had that quip about amateurs study strategy while professionals study logistics. And I've always thought that was kind of harsh on strategists. And I took a little grievance at that, but he does have, or did have, a bit of a point. An analogous point in this context might be that it is wrong to assume that a technological solution, regardless of its cleverness, is going to necessarily carry the field by itself. These things exist in a context, and I think the reports do a good job of pointing us to that context, and indeed that's what, to some degree, we're talking about here today. The organizational context of how do you actually build a system that is able effectively to do horizon scanning and the analytical feed into a policymaking process that is sufficient to permit our country to compete effectively with a country that is organized in the ways that PJ was referring to. So I would say an analogous Bradley comment would be that please don't forget that techno system, if you will, because if you don't get that right, it doesn't matter how clever your widget is going to be. It needs all of these pieces to come together, and thinking about that is the equivalent of, that's the logistics piece here. Strategy is critically important to knowing what you need to do, but thinking very, very concretely and with wisdom about the details of how to get from there to here in a complex bureaucratic, regulatory, and political environment. If you don't think through those pieces and aren't able to handle those challenges, you're not going to get where you need to go. Those are my two framing points, and I don't know what you would offer there as well, but please.
So I think that's super helpful, Chris. I think basically I'll probably repeat some of those elements, but sometimes that's a good way to absorb information, I found. This is a big report, right? It's about 118 pages. So I'll give you, the elevator line of what it's about fundamentally. Fundamentally, it is about how you build a technology competition model for the United States, fundamentally. And there are different approaches to the how, right? So to Chris's point. And that's really what we'll talk about this afternoon a little bit. What are the different organizational models for doing that, for building that technology competition model? The private sector is heavily involved. Key theme in the report is the role of the private sector. But what we'll see, and what I hope we talk about a little bit, are some of the challenges inherent in what's described here. So I see some challenges personally. These are my personal views, not as a member of the advisory board of CSP, but at the heart of innovation is ultimately a capitalist system, right? The energy of capitalism has driven American innovation. So how do we balance that with more government involvement and the nature of government involvement? That's a fundamental tension. A second tension related is how do you synchronize but not stifle, right? Related to the first. But as someone who's worked in government for several years, many years, on and off, I'm very, I'm wary of government as well, right? There's very few examples of government acting with alacrity. And this is a competition that's based on speed. And what's that balance between directives and incentives, right? So I'm also interested in that, and the report hints at, how you create the incentives in that environment to encourage the private sector. Chris has mentioned, the question is an important one of creating a competitive model. Why? Because China's not competing in a level playing field, right? Keoki and I were talking about this a little bit earlier today. China's engaging in what Liza Tobin, who's also part of SCSP, she's called brute force economics. And it's actually a great article that she wrote in the Texas National Security Review. I encourage you all to read it. If China's engaging in brute force economics, it's not a level playing field anymore, right? And so fundamentally, this panel's report and the mission of this whole enterprise is to figure out how you compete with that type of economic system. And third, finally, another element of this is how do you prevent specifically more technology gaps from emerging? So it's proactive, looking at the policies we need, but there's also an element to how do you play catch up as well? And how do you ensure that the United States retains what the report calls a position of dominance in key tech sectors? And there are different approaches to doing that. I can go in later when we start the discussion a little bit about the 4 fundamental models that I see in the report, but I'll sort of add those as my framing comments and some things to keep in mind as we talk about the government's role in all of this. Thanks. And Chris, but as I do turn, I know that you wanted to sort of expand a little bit on some of your earlier points, and Yvonne, specifically about the private sector's incentives to getting involved.
Sure. I think for the reasons that exactly the ones you're describing, getting this right is sort of a sine qua non piece. I mean, we know what it looks like and how it works to have a whole-of-nation coordinated competitive strategy for technology if you happen to be in charge of something called the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing. There are tools, there are incentives, there are entire structures that are set up to enable you, if you are such a person, to direct huge numbers of people to go do what you tell them to do. Invest in this particular technology that we think is going to be important, and by goodness, people will go invest in that technology. You can direct corporations, both at home and abroad, individual citizens, lots of people within your jurisdiction, to go follow direction on that. And they've gotten a lot of mileage out of using those tools of coercive command direction to bring their system into a position of, as we heard from the opening remarks, in which it's not clear that there is, in fact, a single technology hegemon in the world today. So it's been successful in that respect, but we certainly do not want our leaders to follow that toolkit. First of all, it's not available, and A. B, it's immoral, and C, it's just, it's a terrible idea, and no one ever would suggest that. However, we still need to not lose this competition. So the challenge for us as a country, as a government, as a system, is how do we find an appropriate American version of technology competition, which, as you indicated, Nadia, involves a lashing together of both private sector tools and institutions with public sector tools and institutions with private sector incentives and actors and stakeholders, and lots of folks in between, the academic community, the NGO community, FFRDCs of all things, national laboratories. All of these pieces of the system need to work together very effectively, but this is fundamentally a voluntarist system. We do not, and for very good reasons, allow our leaders the power to direct outcomes in this system. And so there's necessarily a great deal of emphasis that needs to be placed, maybe the most important emphasis, not upon command direction, but upon persuasive vision and coordination in a voluntarist way. And making that work is really the heart of the problem. And it's not fundamentally a technology question. It's a politics and vision and how do you persuade people to work together. And so I think we really need to focus on that. Because there are such sharp limits on what Uncle Sam can do, and that makes it hard. Now the SCSP's reports are optimistic and bullish on this. There are comments in there about how the private sector is primed to cooperate and to collaborate with the public sector in making this all happen. But I just want to stress, it does occur to me that we don't live in precisely we live in rather divided and polarized and fractious political times. And if there is one thing on which I think both the right and the left in this country can come together, it is presumably on not losing this technology competition that we face with China. So I have great optimism in this respect, but we should not pretend that it will be easy. There will be a lot of work required of all of us, of figuring out how to work the incentives piece, both from an economic perspective, whereas private sector stakeholders are concerned, and simply from a motivational perspective. People need to understand the importance of this and see a viable path forward that they feel a compelling need to be a part of and to make succeed. I'm not ruling this out, but we shouldn't pretend this is going to be simple or easy. It's going to be a critical piece without which all of the clever organizational ideas that the reports in fact put forward won't work, because you won't have the cross-sectoral whole-of-nation buy-in that you need. So strong emphasis upon this voluntarist aspect would be one of the points that I'd like to flag. Questions for you, if you don't mind, Nadia. The reports I thought taught, in this very respect, how do you bring the pieces of the U.S. system together? The SCSP's reports make some very interesting points about how the system that we need to coordinate now is not quite the same system that we, to some degree, learned how to coordinate back in the Vannevar Bush era in the early Cold War. The report refers to a geometry of innovation and makes the argument that geometry is changing. There are new elements coming in. The relationship between the previous elements is not the same as it was when we dealt with our Sputnik moment. So if you don't mind, I'd love to hear you unpack that a bit for people who are listening and watching this, in terms of what you think of that concept, how you think it helps us organize our thoughts in this, and where you see that going.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I think the report is not just about spelling out the problems, but it really plays a useful role in putting forth some of the inputs into this broader model of this competitive model. And one of these ideas is a concept they call the innovation of the geometry of innovation, or innovation geometry, right? So in the past, that innovation sector was made up essentially of three components: academia, government, and industry, sort of old-fashioned industry, Bell Labs, AT&T industry, IBM industry. The new geometry of innovation adds two more components to that. The crowd, essentially the internet, people, all of the innovative nodes out there that just come with the internet and come from that type of communication, as well as the private sector. And I think the difference between industry and private sector is essentially the private sector today is seen as smaller. All of the VC firms, PE firms, the plethora of different financing mechanisms that exist today and companies that exist today. So there are now 5 components to this innovation geometry, and understanding how those other two work and creating an ecosystem that allows the power of those other two elements, the crowd and the private sector, to flourish is part of the puzzle. So that's one of the key kind of ideas within the report. But there are a couple others that I want to put out there as well, because I think it's worth thinking about these specific components to this competitive model. So in addition to the innovation geometry, there's a framework and idea for evaluating the strategic significance of a technology. Right? We don't take that for granted. What's significant, and why is a particular technology significant? And the report goes into some detail about how to make those evaluations. And you at MITRE, many of you are the engineers and the technologists, and weighing in on that, I think, is really important. The report also sets forth what a tech sphere of influence looks like. What is a technology sphere of influence? How do we know we're in one? How do we know we're influential in a tech sphere of influence? So we know with China, for instance, they dominate one in commercial drones, right? We know that because DJI makes up a huge global market share. So that's an example of how you would dominate one tech sphere of influence. What are others, and what are the components you need to position yourself in a dominant way in that sphere? And a final sort of fourth model within this broader paper that I think is important is it lays out, and what Chris discussed early on in his intro, a process for achieving a competitive technology model and plan, and how you end up with technology action plans for these key areas of importance. So there are 4 kind of concrete ways that this report, I think, helps us think about how to organize to do this. And I think I like that about the report, because it's offering, it's not just describing the problem set, but it's providing mini solutions, at least at the 1.0 stage, to get there.
Excellent.
So, I don't know if you want to talk about some of the tech sectors and how you think, we could look at them, or perhaps some of the organizational features. Chris, I know we had spoke a little bit before the panel about your thoughts about whether or not you situate some of these organizational bodies at the White House or in other parts of government.
Sure. On the issue of specific technology strategies, I would refer anyone who has access to the internet to look up a MITRE paper that was published a year and a half or so ago on horizon strategies, which is at least MITRE's effort to think about some of those things. Charles Clancy, I see, is sitting here in the back of the auditorium, and Dwayne Blackburn and I tried to pull some of that together in a publicly facing paper. But on the organizational pieces, in particular, I think.
But wait, can I ask because you used horizon a lot, and maybe for the audience, sort of describe the report's concept of horizon scanning, and then a little bit of how you use horizon in the report with Charles, just so people understand the components of that.
Well, I think they're used in very sort of complementary ways. In the MITRE report, we were specifically referring to technology-specific strategies for looking, essentially trying to see over the horizon and build a strategy to getting to that point, as sort of a technology vision on a technology by technology perspective. In the SCSP context, it's more a question of how is it that you understand, how do you get situational awareness of your sort of short, medium, and longer term technology future. And you didn't use the term, PJ, but one of the things that resonates, I think, there for me is what you were describing a lot in terms of understanding where the adversary is, understanding which technologies are evolving in which directions, what their strategic significance is. That I think of as essentially being a process of S&T net assessment, if you will. It's not just S&T intelligence. It's not just figuring figuring out what red has. It's understanding where the field as a whole is going, or multiple fields, of course, that may be very significant in different ways, understanding how they might be significant, understanding where the field is going as a whole, where red is trying to go, how likely it is that red will get there, where blue is going, and where all the other colors of the rainbow and the international environment are going as well, because it is a giant ecosystem that one needs to understand. And we don't really have mechanisms in place for providing that kind of situational awareness and analytical foundation that is necessary for leaders. I mean, you mentioned technology action plans, as the reports call for. To do one of those properly, one would need to have a great deal of information in a way that our leaders aren't really equipped to get yet. And actually, Don Myrex and I here at MITRE just published a paper on S&T net assessment and the importance of that function. I would encourage if anyone wants to look that up, that's also hopefully a useful read. But I think the reports do a fantastic job of pointing us in the direction, and the horizon scanning process and the technology evaluation process and the work that is envisioned being done by the Office of Global Competition Analysis, as proposed by the SCSP, for instance, provide a potential window into that, which I guess brings us to the organizational forms question. Right?
But I think before we get to that, I think there's an important point in all of this about the dynamic nature of all of this, with net assessments, with strategy, that even the idea of what does it mean to retain a dominant position in one of these tech sectors, it's not that you've just gotten there. There's an element that always has to be maintaining it, right? So there's a constant, in the military world, the offense-defense dialectic. There's that same dialectic that will go on in this domain as well, and thinking about it, and ensuring that actors in the domain have the flexibility to continue to do those assessments as necessary, or to maintain their position as necessary. So it's not just that you've achieved it and are going to pat yourself on the back, because there's always going to be a counterpoint to it.
And the interactions between them, right? You've achieved the dominant position in aluminum and rivets-based aerospace. Right. Fantastic, that's great. All of a sudden, information technology comes along, and space-based comms. You're like, oh my God, what's happening? These things have feedback relationships between each other. They're very, very complex systems in the literal technical sense, not just figuratively speaking. And one has to have the right kind of analytical support and just deep expertise to understand one's environment in order to make decisions wisely in that context. So hugely challenging. None of this is easy, but it's incredibly important. And I do think we have, this country does not lack smart, informed people able to think in these terms across a bewildering variety of important and strategically potentially transformative technology areas. We just need to figure out a way, and that's what the reports point us to, a way to bring them together in a way that, in fact, helps us collectively meet that need.
And that does lead to organization. So the challenge of creating an organization that allows that dynamism to flourish, right, and to be maintained. And that doesn't always happen easily. And so I know Chris had some views about situating, some of these offices in a place like the White House.
Well, sure. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well, from given your experience in government. Also, I mean, the reports offer a very interesting sort of hybrid model, as it's described. There is proposed to establish a White House-based technology competitiveness council to help coordinate federal approaches to these kinds of challenges, to lead the policy process in this regard, basically. Supported in some respect by, as I mentioned before, an Office of Global Competition Analysis. I don't recall the location of that being specified, except that it wouldn't be in the White House. It would be an ongoing analytical cell, if you will, to provide support for that kind of work. Someplace else to help support this horizon scanning and technology action plan development process, as well as a third institution, a U.S. Advanced Technology Forum. That would be something of correct me if I'm wrong, you all out there in the audience, but it would be essentially a locus for private sector and public sector stakeholders to come together in a way that feels a little bit less like you're being dragged into a situation room in the White House and being command-directed to give your views in order to inform policy, but more of a free-flowing engagement opportunity for all of these sectors to come together under the kind of inspired technology vision that I was urging us to all work to develop in my framing remarks. So I think that's a terrific model to aim for. But let me be a little bit of devil's advocate here and push back to you, perhaps, Nadia, a little bit on this, because wiring diagrams, the last time we encountered a strategic competitor in a technology challenge, our system was very innovative. Right? The National Security Act of 1947 took a fractious and divided departmental system and gave it a degree of structure, creating the National Security Council, for instance, paving the way for the creation of a National Security Council staff to support that process, and that kind of thing. So, in creating a national security process itself for decision making, that was ended up being extraordinarily valuable during the course of the Cold War. That was also the period in which you saw the creation of a whole range of new institutions, sort of kind of outside government. FFRDCs, to which I alluded before. And MITRE got started in 1958 to do the systems engineering for what became NORAD. We've got a broad ecosystem ranging from the national labs through a whole kaleidoscope of FRDCs, supporting federal sponsors in a range of issues that are not just strategic competition, but certainly during the Cold War were absolutely essential. So our system can definitely innovate organizationally. And so I think the SCSP makes a very, very compelling set of proposals in terms of those sort of three inter-supporting institutions. But I've also been around Washington long enough to know that your plans don't always work out exactly as one would like, or if they do, they may take a while. And so I guess I would also urge us to have, at least in the back of our mind, what is Plan B, or what's the bridging strategy to the future when those things finally come to pass, because it may not be tomorrow morning. And so how do we make the best use of our current institutions until such point as we can put in place the kind of structures that the SCSP recommends? And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. You've seen many aspects of this over the last few years, but your thoughts on that would be great.
I think the overall idea of creating a mechanism to produce the more competitive plans or technology action plans is important. That doesn't mean that part of that, though, involves building on what people have already done, right? The report mentions there's something like 72 tech priority lists out there. That means different lists, 72 different lists that list a lot of the same technologies on there, right? So I'm not sure we know, everyone in this room probably knows the 10 key priority areas. And the report actually identifies, I think, 7 key tech sectors, right, at least within there. So I think the problem is that these organizations that the report identifies as potentially being useful will run up against the ingrained government problems that still exist. One is in the acquisition space. So if you listen to a lot of the BCs, private sector, small companies out there, one of their consistent problems is is achieving scale, right? And the SCSP report on the economy and their economics panel talks about this more, the valley of death, things like that. So I think my one constructive comment for this report would be to link more to those existing obstacles. So how do the horizon scanning, how does the forward-looking elements of what these models have to do, what happens when they bump up against the same old system? And that's a big problem. We also need an element of tearing down the same old system. It cannot continue to exist the way it does, or we have to create workarounds that become permanent, partly. So I'm not sure how to do that exactly, but I think it's going to run into that problem of stifling the real innovation and the ideas behind this report. So that's one of my concerns. The second one is how do you get the private sector to see this as a cooperative and not a competitive endeavor? I mean, it is inherently competitive in one way, right? If you're a private sector actor, VC fund, PE fund, you want the competitive advantage from having invested in a technology that you think is going to take you ahead of your peers. So how do you create an alignment in their minds, and can you, to create a sense that we're all in this for a shared purpose, a shared sense of responsibility? And can we do that? I don't know. I'd like to hear more from the private sector on that. So those are two thoughts. I like the idea of the report uses the idea of creating an entity that's adjacent to government, because sometimes that gives it much more flexibility. So you have the best of what government has to offer, the reach in, the knowledge, the ability to share information, but creating it adjacent gives you some of the flexibility, to hire people, which you can't do in government very easily, to fire people, which you can't do in government very easily. So you have the ability to essentially have some of those workarounds by creating an entity that's adjacent. So I was kind of in favor. If I had to have my vote, I liked the adjacent model. Understanding that you need some coordination,
Is there a template for that? Can you give is there an anecdote we can use that actually helps us understand that?
Use USIP.
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if all listeners could hear the unmiked question, but question: is there a template for that kind of organization? And PJ suggested USIP as one, but I would say from my own perspective, there are a number of different potential templates, each of which could be applicable to a different aspect of it. There may be private sector engagements. I mean, in the cybersecurity world, for example, there was a huge challenge. I remember this when I was on the Hill. We struggled with this and ultimately had to fix it in legislation. There are many challenges that private sector actors were uneasy to some degree about sharing information about cybersecurity challenges with the government. Or certainly they would never share them with their competitors in the commercial marketplace. And so it was necessary to work some sort of liability and information sharing issues. There has been, there are models out there. I mean, it's just from a MITRE perspective, there are models with respect to safety analysis for the FAA, for example, where, if I'm Delta and you're United or something, like, we're certainly not going to share every bit of safety relevant information with each other. We'll share as little with each other as we possibly can, I would imagine. Nor are we necessarily going to share everything with the government that we are not required to share, but that there are ways to bring people together in a kind of a intermediated environment with, sort of a trusted intermediary with whom there are, some data protection agreements, so that one can share enough with someone who can actually do the analytical support, but with all the players being confident that their rivals are not going to get things that are sensitive crossways, nor is the government going to get more than the government is entitled to get under the existing regulatory apparatus. So it's a way to help bridge the public-private divide in a way that allows for sophisticated data analytics for the public good and protects the equities of all the stakeholders involved. There are probably like half a dozen different pieces of this that already exist in an organizational form, a conceptual form someplace in the U.S. ecosystem. An institution like the SCSP is perfectly positioned to survey that, horizon scanning in this respect as well, right? This is not just about technology in the code and widget sense. It's about technology in the how do you organize things sense. I mean, techne, in its ancient Greek root, is not just knowledge, it's knowledge for a purpose. So what we're talking about in technology is using knowledge to accomplish actual things. And organizational forms and bureaucratic processes and how to organize effectively is part of technique as well.
I think in terms of models too, as PJ said, there's USIP. There might also be worth looking at the National Endowment for Democracy, which is independent, funded by Congress, but operates, I would say, very much adjacent to other agencies. I think, within government, a model to look at for a coordinating mechanism within government would be PEPFAR, which was situated at the State Department, played a huge role in the AIDS epidemic and reducing it and making huge progress. But if you look at how that was done, state had a lot of control over where the money was going. Other entities fed into it, but I like the PEPFAR model a lot, and that could be one where, if we're going to create something at the White House level, it would be on that model of having authority, but the inputs of other relevant agencies. So those are some thoughts. I think they're externally also looking at how large organizations like the Gates Foundation functioned and worked very closely with the US government in key areas. And how did that work? So I think there are probably 10 different models we could come up with, taking the best of them and then creating, it's not either or. I see this as being an adjacent model along with a couple of key changes within government.
I know we need to offer a little bit of a chance for Q&A, but actually let me just riff off that PEPFAR thing just for 1 second too, because it also illustrates the degree to which this is not just a question of the US public-private system, right? We are not in this alone and we can't win this alone. There are lots of folks who share our interest in not having China win the global technology competition and gain the windfall benefits geopolitically that it anticipates getting from such a victory. There are a lot of folks with whom we can and must collaborate. And that's not just in terms of governments, it's also in terms of private sector and NGO and civil society and who knows who else across the international arena in many, many ways. And PEPFAR is a great example of that as well, because the whole point was this is an outward-facing engagement to help countries, partner countries, with intractable, societally transformative, in a bad way, problems, and to solve those problems. And it was not just an sort of bring aid to those who need aid, but an actual partnership model in which our interagency and lots of private sector stakeholders came together to provide assistance that ultimately helped transition partner countries to being able to stand on their own in this challenging environment, this sort of disease-related environment of fighting the AIDS epidemic. And so there's an international cross-border aspect to the PEPFAR success story as well. Anyway. So questions from our audience. How should we do that? We've got a couple of mics here set up, and if anyone feels not shy, they should step up and
I'd add another model as well we might throw out there, the Development Finance Corporation, looking at how that works, how it's sort of the statutory way it was created, and the authorities it has or doesn't have. So again, these are not in the tech sector necessarily, but in government, if you're able to pull one example from others, it often helps.
Excellent. So if anyone would like to ask a question, this would be a great time. Otherwise, I'll plague you with maybe another one. Nadia.
Or we can, go.
There we go.
I'm Mike Nelson with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and part of the Technology International Affairs program there. But way back when I was in the Clinton administration at OSTP, and I worked with Vice President Gore in trying to remove the barriers that were in the way of the digital economy that we managed to jumpstart so effectively in the 90s. So I look at this sort of in a different way. On my tombstone, I wanted to say, here lies Mike Nelson. He stopped stupid stuff. Much of my career has been trying to erase those old rules that you mentioned and the old mechanisms that get in the way of the person who actually in the end teams up with other persons to make technology happen, not just to invent it, but to innovate enough that it's actually useful and then hand it off or work with others to make it commercial. So I guess think about how this would sound to the actual innovator, to the 23-year-old. What does a person-centered innovation system look like? And what are the 2 or 3 questions that we should ask? And how can we help that person find the barriers that are getting in his or her way? Sometimes they don't know. Sometimes it's the copyright lawyer in the other office. Sometimes it's the restrictions on funding. Sometimes it's the inertia of the university that they want to work with. How can we flip this around? We're starting here talking about the top. Where are the organizational boxes going to be? How do we instead start by looking at what's actually affecting those people doing the work?
That's an outstanding question. I hope this won't seem like it's a punt, but I sort of feel like my own sensibilities are sort of Hayekian enough to think that there is no way that a bunch of folks, however bright they are, can get together in a room in Washington and come up with a technology action plan that will solve all of our needs just because they're smart and well-informed and are sitting in a room for 3 or 4 days. And no one will let them out until they come up with a plan. You can do good stuff that way, but you can't answer these problems in the way that you're describing. And some of this will have to be a process that can listen, that knows it needs to listen, but that is also at the same time willing, and this goes back to my initial comment about vision. Folks need to, there needs to be a degree of appreciation for the fact that we face a significant challenge and articulating the potential. The reports do a good job of this in articulating what it would be like to lose a strategic technology competition. And so I would love to see a world in which everyone was inspired enough by the vision of how we need to address this problem in a radically different way than we have for a long time, but in a process in which folks in Washington don't sort of sit there. If I were the 23-year-old looking at this from some tech development piece, I would imagine that I would be just a little bit alarmed by a bunch of folks in Washington saying, we're going to have a plan, right? This is one of the old joke about, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. It's like, oh my God. We don't want this to feel like that, and if it feels like that, it will fail. So we need to be able to provide a vision of collective endeavor and put meaning into this, but in a way that carefully refrains from trying to dictate solutions in a way that would be off-putting to those whose input we need to be listening to. And we need to be wise enough to build institutions to do that listening and to listen to those who come in who are able themselves to listen to those who would not be willing to talk to us because we are government bureaucrats and, techies in the Washington Beltway. We're just barely inside the Beltway, by the way, here at the Robb Auditorium, so we're still technically inside the Beltway institution in this respect, but that would be my thought, which is, I hope it's not an invasion, but I think to acknowledge that that is in fact a need and a problem is the starting point. Do you have any, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to jump in.
Yeah, so I would ask probably specifically, what are the obstacles that, I would ask the young technologist or CEO, what are the obstacles external to your company that we can help you resolve or take away or pull away? So what government obstacles exist? What regulatory obstacles exist? Is there an element of risk that you're facing and that government or external actors can help you, mitigate for, so you can take the risk you need? What's the balance between R&D versus capital investments that you need? And then looking at the formulas for that. And those are all of those kinds of questions and lines of inquiry have specific answers for government. And then scale would also be one as well. For your company to get to scale in 5 years, what does it look like and what customers do you need? And then thinking about how government can play a constructive role in that area in terms of, with all of those thinking that government will have some say in that, for better or worse, or part of it might be just stay out of the way.
We're here for the government, and we're here to help. What do you mean by help? Not what do we mean by help. Awesome. Nadia, it is such a pleasure to both see you again and to have the chance to work with you on this fantastic event and this panel today. I hope we've managed to get things framed at least a bit, and I'm looking very much forward to hearing where the panel discussions and then ultimately, in some cases, some workshop engagements look like as the course of the day progresses. Thank you all very much for the honor of being able to be here. So it's great to see you.
Thank you so much to Chris and Nadia for kicking us off today. A wonderful start at the high level for our conversation for this plenary session. My name is Will Moreland. I'm a director for future tech platforms with SCSP, and it's my pleasure to transition us to our next session, which will be a call to action. It'll have 2 presentations back to back and then question and answer period. So first, let me introduce Dwayne Blackburn here at MITRE. He helped establish and co-leads MITRE's Center for Data-Driven Policy, which leverages the work of MITRE's 10,000 employees to help ensure that federal policies and strategies are evidence-based, actionable, and effective. Prior to joining MITRE, Dwayne served for 8 years, spanning 2 administrations, as an assistant director at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. He led and supported multiple interagency and public-private policy teams through a period of significant transition and transformation of the government's homeland security and intelligence enterprises, and his leadership approach was studied to help identify the critical attributes within the nation's highest performing public servants. He also previously served as an R&D program manager in the FBI, the National Institute of Justice, and the DoD. And then after Dwayne, we'll welcome back a familiar face to you today, PJ Makish. PJ is a senior advisor with SCSP. Prior to SCSP, he was director for technology competition at the National Security Council. He directed the classified research for the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. And prior to the NSCAI, PJ developed third offset technology solutions for the DoD to enhance deterrence credibility within the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He has 24 years of experience in military operations, including serving as commander of the U.S. Central Command's Combat Air Operations Center from 2017 to 2019 during the ISIL conflict. So without further ado, welcome Dwayne to the stage.
Thank you, Will, and others for the talk that preceded me. We certainly are facing a very daunting challenge as we go forward, but I'm also convinced that this country is nowhere near the ceiling of what is possible. So I'm very thankful that SCSP is working to design a new model for us to tackle this upcoming problem. And I'm especially happy for all of you all here in the room as well joining us virtually to join us today, because the key thing that we're trying to accomplish with this is to gather your inputs as we develop this new model. But as we're doing that, I want to make sure that everyone also recognizes that we're not completely starting from scratch. There have been a lot of prior efforts or building blocks that we can learn from and also leverage. And that's what they've asked me to talk about today. So let's start looking at Congress, and particularly the Government Accountability Office and their science and technology team. Now, over the last 3 years, this entity has grown from just a small handful of individuals to over 140 staff in just 3 years. And their role is to analyze science and technology issues and to develop guidance for Congress as they tackle these activities. As they do this, not only have they grown in that staff, but they've also begun to leverage external experts, over 300 external experts as they design it. So this is a good foreshadowing of what's possible, because GAO is already starting to do it, to leverage these outside experts to develop that guidance. GAO staff team has also developed an advisory board, which they call the Polaris Council. You can see the members of the council along the bottom. In our last meeting a couple of months ago, we really focused on 2 different questions. The first question, how the heck can GAO STA do a better job informing Congress about its science and technology issues? We spent a lot of time amongst these groups of entities studying, analyzing that, and providing recommendations over to GAO. The second question very closely aligns with what we talked about earlier today. What are the science and technology issues that Congress will have to be working on 3 or 4 years down the road? Let's work to identify those now so that we can get the experts lined up and do the analyses so we have the recommendations ready once Congress is ready to start working on them. That's all within GAO. Within Congress itself, of course, in the last Congress that just ended a couple of weeks ago, or a couple of days ago actually, they passed the CHIPS and Science Act. And the science aspect of that act was arguably the most significant policy legislation over the last several decades. It authorizes a suite of new regional technology developments as well as investments in S&T infrastructures that will enable us to do a lot of this. Now, to be honest, a lot of that was authorizations that haven't been appropriated quite yet. I'm not going to go in depth there. Honestly, if you want detailed appropriations, you go talk to Matt. He knows it better than anybody else. The current Congress, struggling to get started, to be honest, but even as they work through that, they have signaled an intent to create something called a Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party, which would investigate and submit policy recommendations on the status of China's economic, technological, and security progress and its competition with the United States. So within the legislative branch of our government, activities aligned with what we're trying to do here have already begun. Much the same can be said about the executive branch of our government. Talking S&T, we really start thinking first and foremost about the Office of Science and Technology Policy. A couple of us in the room here today have experience there. I'm going to not go all the way back to the Clinton administration like our previous speaker. I'm going to start with the next administration, the Bush administration. They really started to put out these grand challenge documents around core science and technology priorities. So each of these challenge documents not only served as policy inside the federal government, as far as, all right, agencies, this is the type of thing that we need you to focus on, but it also served as a discussion medium between the federal agencies and those outside the federal government to enable those conversations to take place and to enable at least some rudimentary collaboration between them. That was in the Bush administration. The Obama administration was very big on prize-based challenges. So these are more, not necessarily on the strategic side, but bringing the crowd, the millions of individuals that are out there in the country to help solve identified government problems. So again, bringing private sector in to solve these big problems. Fast forward to the next administration, the Trump administration really began to consistently use requests for information as they were designing their strategies. Now, prior administrations did this as well, but the Trump administration started to do it more than anyone else. And to be honest, the current administration is doing that on steroids. The amount of RFIs that the Biden folks are pumping out as they're developing the strategies are far and away more than the prior administrations. So there's this appetite for external input as they're developing their science and technology strategies. This administration is also very big on looking at data that the government has, making that available so that other folks, non-government entities, can leverage that data in the research, hopefully to help, again, solve government problems. Now, across all of these administrations, there's been this entity that not a lot of people have heard of, but the National Science and Technology Council. This is the entity that supports OSTP in its policy development on science and technology topics. And it consists of the agencies that fund science and technology activities. So for every priority that the administration will have for science and technology, they'll create a subcommittee within this National Science and Technology Council. And that subcommittee will have the leaders of every federal agency for that topic. They will get together and they will collaborate with the White House in developing that strategy. Again, go back to the Grand Challenges document. So that's still continuing. The NSTC is the entities that the White House uses to get that interagency knowledge into developing that strategy. And I'll be honest, that group has been very, very good at coordinating what the executive branch is doing on these topics. It has not always been quite as good at that public-private collaboration aspect. Frankly, most NSTC entities feel that is outside their normal purview because it's not specifically mentioned in the NSTC's charter. But that's not always been the case. I'm a problem child, so when I was there, I ignored that. And several others have done that in the years past as well. So there have been NSTC subcommittees, as they're developing and implementing the strategies, that actively work with the private sector to implement and again, to develop the strategies to begin with. For example, some subcommittees have hosted annual conferences to get government, industry, and academia together to exchange information about what's coming down and what the issues are. Some subcommittees have had formal workshops, inviting people in, just like we're doing here, to get that input as they're developing it. Some others still have really led national and even international level efforts to develop standards or to develop guidance for policymakers on what the heck these topics need to be working on. So lots of different things going on. Also within the White House, I'm going to shift gears a little bit outside of OSTP to something that most people probably haven't heard about, but this was something, an activity within the Office of Management and Budget in the prior administration called the Government Effectiveness Advanced Research Center, or the GEAR Center. Now, the GEAR Center was envisioned as a public-private partnership to bring together experts from different disciplines to help the federal government better leverage innovative technologies and business practices in its operations. So a little bit different than what we're talking about here, science and technology advancement versus government operations. But what you can see is a lot of the work that went into the GEAR Center has a lot of similarities with what we're talking about here today. So this GEAR Center would include a public-private scanning of needs and opportunities, collaborative development of strategies, and joint research and pilots against those strategies. Now, as the concept started to be addressed, MITRE and OMB collaborated to actually design this thing. So we developed an operating model for the GEAR Center that included a federal government role, a network of networks to both forecast possibilities and to collaborate on research and pilots, and an operator entity that serves as both a strategic and tactical coordinator, and as well as a trusted third party between government and private sector. So a lot of what Nadia and Chris just kind of talked about. So at a high level, again, there's a lot of similarities between the GEAR design and what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to start to talk about some of these building blocks and lessons learned from that effort, again, to help to get your minds running so that you'll be able to work efficiently within our breakout sessions. So takeaway lesson number one from the GEAR Center. So you have to identify the critical networks and how to strategically leverage them. So the partners that we identified as critical to the GEAR effort are very similar to what we've been talking about here today. Maybe not so much the state and local government lane that you see here, maybe replace that with regional innovation hubs, but everything else pretty well aligns. Now each has different qualities and thus brings different insights and capabilities to this joint endeavor. MITRE and OMB's analyses showed that success of the GEAR Center itself would depend on reaching large groups of thought leaders within each of these ecosystems quickly and systematically. Now note as well in the descriptions of each that we did not envision taking a shotgun approach to each vertical category, but rather strategically identify entities within those lanes that had existing networks that we could leverage and could help meet the specific goals that we identified for the GEAR Center. We also recognize that each participant's role would vary, not only by these verticals, but more importantly, by their level of commitment and involvement, which we organized into the three buckets that you see at the bottom. Now, most entities would fall in that knowledge category, but very few entities, only the ones that are very deeply ingrained, will become part of the governance process. Second lesson learned from the GEAR Center that could be useful here is the need to create a value proposition for the partners that do participate. Much like what we're talking about today, the Gear Center was envisioned as a volunteer collaboration. So each partnering organization must feel some value to drive them to participate. Let's be honest, as much as we'd like to believe it, national competitiveness probably isn't going to be the primary driver for a lot of these people to participate. So high-level value propositions are shown here. So for example, some are driven by having access to federal policymakers, others by access to data and piloting opportunities, and still others to learn from their peers and identify ways to partner with them. So the Gear Center and the leadership would have to determine which of these are going to be the drivers for each individual participant, and then work to leverage them to ensure that they see it. The third step, lesson learned, is that government has critical leadership and support roles. In our last talk, we talked a lot about I'm from the government, I'm here to help, and how evil that can be received. But let's be honest, the government has to play a big role in what we do here. So, for example, a couple of things, they have an unprecedented convener ability. I'm very happy that so many of the people that we invited to attend here today and online actually did. Much, much greater turnout than what normal events do. But I'll also be honest, when I was in the White House, I got a much higher rate of return. It's pretty easy to convince somebody to come to the White House. So how can we leverage that? The government also has huge amounts of data to use in research. That's often talked about. What's not often talked about is the ability for government to really provide some potential use cases in which to pilot technologies. That's a very, very big opportunity for advancing things that most people often forget. We also need to talk about metrics a little bit. So the fourth lesson is to measure impacts and grow it over time. So the impact and value of each effort must be measured using success metrics that reflect both its individual purpose and its role in meeting the overarching goal that it supports, such as the impact shown here for the Gear Center. Now, obviously, the metrics going forward for what we're doing here will be a little slightly different. But the point is to keep in mind that while you're crafting these metrics, you also need to recognize that they will need to evolve over time. So during the early stages, the emphasis will be on crafting a working infrastructure, developing key processes, and building a network of partners. Your metrics or measures during this period need to correspond to these efforts. As the effort matures and moves into the middle and latter stages, you're going to start to see operationally tangible benefits. And so the measures need to reflect that as well. Now, last takeaway that I'm going to do to share with you all is the criticality of timing. Innovation itself doesn't happen as a step function. It typically follows very predictive adoption productivity curves. And so we need to recognize that. There are a couple of other timing things that we also need to keep in mind because of the role that the government's going to have in this. And the first, bottom left here, is the R&D budget cycle of the federal government. At any given time, the federal government is working on 3 different fiscal years. So right now we're in January of 2023. So the federal agencies are working to implement their FY23 budgets. They're nearing completion of their FY24 requests and are starting to identify their priorities for FY25. It's a battleship turn issue. You need to get ahead of that as quickly as possible. Now, last point that I need to make is again, recognizing what's going on in the government. There's a quadrennial presidential election, and that can have impacts. And that's very critically important. To be honest, in the Gear Center, that was a concept that was developed by an individual administration, and work began on the Gear Center in the middle of that administration. So the design work occurred, and it was quite good, but implementation did not begin before the next election had happened. And in this case, that president lost his reelection. The incoming president and their administration had different priorities. The Gear Center concept largely kind of withered away. We can't allow that to happen here. The advantage that we have, though, is that we're beginning this process before the next presidential transition. We're going to design it now and be able to implement it on day one of the incoming administration. We'll be able to get enough good things happening that 4 years later, we'll be able to continue. So again, we're not starting from scratch. There's a lot of lessons learned and building blocks that we can leverage. So try to keep those in mind as we continue throughout the day. It's now my pleasure to turn it back over to PJ. So we're going to have a shift from me looking backwards to PJ looking forward. I'll come back up.
Okay. Thank you, Dwayne. Thank you so much. Dwayne teaches us that the first intelligent rule of tinkering is to keep all of the parts and to study what we have and where we've come from. And I do think there is this important responsibility we all have to preserve the intellectual continuity with those who've gone before us, just as the questioner who came up brought up the fact that he served under the Clinton administration. And we are all building upon this. And now the question is, because we're in a competition which is transacting in technologies that could shape the three large futures that we had talked about in the beginning, the first part we thought about is how would we offer what a public-private model would look like rather than leaving it to chance? So rather than just saying we need one, we beta tested for a year what is the private sector and what is the public sector telling us it could look like. And that's the result of the research we'll provide you here with today. Simply for your plenaries to say, this is where we are on the map of the public-private process that we're seeking to kind of curate as a completely voluntary process across the country. So the first question is, are we asking the right questions as a nation? And when you go across the organizations that Dwayne did so expertly, we find that they're all asking different questions. Even the NSC and OSTP ask fundamentally different questions most of the time. So, what are those minimum essential questions that a nation ought to ask to chart its course, to begin the strategy process, in essence, to make sure logic rule number one, are we asking the right questions? So one question that we've asked ourselves is, are the technologies we're talking about general purpose technologies that pervade most functions of society? So what you see here on the map is just something we published that's certainly out in the literature, but just to talk about the step changes from mechanization in 1780, moving on to electrification to the grid with the creation of AC current by 1890 in America. Automation, if you look at American auto plants, you can place it in a couple different places, approximately 1970. By 1986 and 1991, you have the digital world emerging, depending on how you measure it, the creation of the first website, 1991. And if you were to put those together with AI, so intelligent machines as a fifth wave, before we even get to biotech, what you really see is the merger of robotics, the confluence of those five general purpose technologies today. It is at once, we're talking about machines that are electrified, they have autonomous behavior, and they are now communicating with large language models using artificial intelligence. So that's what a confluence technology looks like, but they're general purpose technologies that pervade most aspects of society. Another question that gets asked in part that Chris alluded to really well is what I would at first call a comparative analysis before we even get to a net assessment, which is different in our minds. But simply, where are we? And this is a debatable subject. And what we found is that there's a number of irrationalities in the system, such as the fact that the intelligence community cannot study blue. I'll just start with that one, at the fear that they would be perceived as collecting on blue. Now, I ran a national process last year. It was confidential, where I was able to explore for 3 months, convening whole of government to do this very thing across 7 different categories. And I found it to be a structural thing and explored how would you overcome that, but it's challenging. This is one that we did, and we published in the form of a PDB, just a presidential decision brief, just to catch everybody's attention about where do we think we are, purely using comparative analysis. We have a short version of this that's 3 pages. We have a long version of this that's gusting 30 pages in the report. But the point is, are we asking these questions, and is anybody answering it? You see, a lot of people want to know where we are, but who in government or with the private sector who knows some of the answers to these questions, by the way? When you speak to Skydio about where DJI is in drones, you're going to get a very informed position than you would say if you ask the IC. So in one sense, we see that China has these dominant positions already in things like advanced batteries. We even did a cross-section of patent trajectories in the world of the next form of battery, post-lithium, and found that Chinese companies already had 40 patents in the next space that's their molten salts. 5G is an obvious battlefield for those who are not close to it. China has an exportable version of 5G, which is in essence defining the future of the internet for other parts of the world who bought that. That has its own story. There is its own government process behind that called trusted networks. And then, of course, commercial drones. China is fantastically advanced in this space. It's not just DJI, it's their ecosystem for drones is really impressive. And so we did a comparative analysis of where they are, where we are on that. And we think it's still trending them. They've just done a demo of a swarm in a forest, which is high science. So Those are the kinds of things that are happening today. What we have in the middle are areas that we regarded as contested, as up for grabs, as so debatable you can't really claim who has positional advantage. And then, of course, on the right side, we put a stethoscope to our own ecosystem because as a 501c3, we have the liberty to do that, and simply said, where do we still think the United States has positional advantages? So the more important part, rather than going through this, is to simply say, these are some of the questions we think should be asked, and I've just addressed three. What is the general purpose technology? Where is the United States and where is China on technologies that we regard as strategic? So ultimately, what this represents is just the learning of going through this process, and not from on high in DC at all, but literally over 300 engagements in the private sector, coast to coast in the United States, to just talk about what are the important questions the nation should be asking. In some cases, we reach back to the philosophy of science. Tech question 1 really draws upon what does it mean to have a technology that could shift the paradigm with which something is operating, like quantum and encryption. What did Kuhn say are the 5 essential criteria? So some of that can get academic in terms of answering the question, and some of it, like red question 1 in the middle, rival factors. Where does China have positional advantage? Someone needs to answer that question to really be strategic. The second question is, where is the United States? Blue question 1 on the far right is, where does the United States have positional advantages? So we could run through these questions. I'm just going to sample a few, because in a public-private process, this is where we think it starts. Not that we have the answers to this, but by, with, and through the entire intellectual capital of the United States, we answer these questions together. That is the proposition. And so, tech question 1, does this technology potentially, in a form of a supposition, trigger a paradigm change? Tech question 2 is the general purpose question. Tech question 3 is, does this technology provide a novel threat for which the United States is not inherently organized? So, for example, if you're watching the way artificial intelligence and autonomy, 2 different subjects, are intersecting with autonomous disinformation platforms and autonomous cyber attack platforms, 2 different subjects, we safely said that is a threat the United States is not aptly prepared for right now. And we could break that down if that's an interesting topic to anyone. That's tech question 3, about novel threats. Tech question 4 and tech question 5 are the 2 main questions that were asked by America's current list. So OSTP's current list, of the 72 that we looked at globally, that was one of them, and it's a rich list, asks these questions. Would this technology fundamentally alter the macroeconomic fundamentals of the United States? And number 5, would this technology fundamentally alter the deterrence credibility of the United States in balance? So those are, we think, important questions to ask. So I'll stop there with the Tech 5 questions. What I just showed you with a comparative analysis was just blue question 1 and blue question 2. And we don't propose to be the ones that are answering that question, but we're trying to beta test and sample what would the process look like if someone did. Now, to Chris's good question about net assessments, we put down there on rival 5, so red question number 5 is really, if I'm not mistaken, it might be 4 actually. So, in the discourse, one good difference between a comparative analysis and a net assessment is, does the comparative analysis lead to a revelation of the weaknesses, asymmetries, and inertias of a rival? Now, once you get into that space, you're in classic net assessment work, because then from that assessment, you can decide moves that might be more advantageous to one side or another. We are radically open to the idea that someone even like MITRE would produce a wonderful net assessment that would give that insight, and the nation should be aggressively seeking that. The Office of Net Assessment could produce one. What we find is they take a long time. There's not a lot of people that do them, and it's a very data-intensive process, which also requires language skills. Therefore, if one is not done, at least do comparative analysis. So that's why it's red 6, not because it belongs at 6, but just because it's not done often. But we think it should be done. And we do think that a wise nation would take advantage of that. So we could go through this in greater detail, but this is just a simple offering. It's not dogmatic, but what we learned from trying to beta test a process of the kinds of questions a nation should ask. Answering it together in a public-private model would be our high view supposition of what should be happening. So to close my section and open up for dialogue, because that's what we'd like to do, and then we'll have a third session that specifically talks about horizon scanning to set you up for your plenary sessions. But what we've supposed by walking around the school, walking around the country, really asking people about this, is that if you take a positioning school approach, for those in business strategy speak and appreciate that language that goes back to the classics of strategic theory, if that's basically your approach, you just, at face value, you can't guarantee how a nation will use power, but you can try to make sure that it has the power it needs 5, 10 years from now to do good strategy. A positioning school argument leads to the fact that it should be studied. This is the horizon scanning function. And what you will hear Abigail Kukura next talk about is the sheer diversity of people in America that do this, but do not do it together. But we found, amazingly, how many of them would like to, but there's no plug-in. So that's the horizon scanning study function where the 21 questions get adjudicated. And of course, we're always open to other questions, but we feel like it's a basic set. And then to get past listing a technology and to actually curate advantage, there is something that begins a planning process. Now, one of the things that we found is that there is a lot of listing, but then there's a barrier of people going past listing to actually take the risk to plan and get into the details of it. One reason, I can go into many, is that all strategy involves a future component, therefore it is a guess. Not everybody's comfortable guessing in such a way to wage a nation's endeavor on a certain technological ambition. We think that we've done that in the past. We have a lot of good examples, to include the moon, of when a nation did say, we are going to do this, this is the reason why, and I'm not second guessing this decision. So there's times and places when such decisions are made, but there's a lot of hemming and hawing around lists. And so the question is, how do you get past listing? We call that process curating. And then of course, we've convened a group of investors from around the country across categories of private equity. They have blown us away because from an example of a tier 1 venture principal who's on this panel to the head investor of one of the more famous foundations, charitable foundations in the country, they don't talk to one another. They don't meet. But when they did, amazing things happened. So if you could think of it this way, we've beta tested, we have a panel of horizon scanners that have their own logic and approach to technology trends. There's a group of technologists that actually build things from a living, from Google to startups you haven't heard of, that can come together in a technology panel. We've been experimenting there. And then there's a third logic filter, which is totally different, which is the commercialization aspect that comes from the investors. And through those 3 filters, we think that when you get downstream with an actual plan that needs to be implemented, that's what a national strategy process should look like in its most basic element. Now, from all of this, you can see the arrows dropping out of it. It shows how the innovation ecosystem has Band-Aids on it to this day, where it needs to be made whole in the same way that Endless Frontiers did so in the 1940s. And so we've been learning as we go. And this year, we really want to chart an effort to crowdsource the country for people who have been thinking about what would an Endless Frontiers 2.0 look like. We have some ideas, but it's just from stumbling upon them as we did this research. And we just think it's probably time for the nation to make the new geometry whole again. Because that really, as Chris was saying, the technosystem is really where the game is. Not a plan, but the system upon which all the plans are actually achieved. So in short, that is where we are on the map. But today, our hope in this great partnership with MITRE and everybody who's made time to join us today online and here is to dive deeply into mechanizing the study phase, the horizon scanning, and how that would be done. So we would love to entertain any questions about anything that we both produced, that is the important parts of our history, the important parts of what the private sector and public strategists are telling us where we think we need to go. And so please, any questions at all online, if anybody can take them, or here to just begin a dialogue. Over to the group. Is there some way to get questions online if there are any? Okay. Very good. John, I know you have a question. You're reliable for good questions. What's your question? What do you think? Go, David, please.
So David Hoyt, Stanford Gordy Knott Center for National Security Innovation. So I think my question is on time. And apologies for the circumlocution of this question. So there seems to be like a recursive element here. We've already named that 2025 to 2030 is the critical time period. When we think about the speed of technology changing and each of the critical technologies changing in different speeds, how are you thinking about how long a horizon scanning lasts, what is the iterative loop, and like what time frame are we thinking about as we kind of work through the rest of the day?
Yeah, Dwayne, you first,
No,
please.
that's all you.
Okay. First of all, David, thank you so much for being here. It's so great to see you. Your name jumped off of me at the list. Thank you for making time to be here. So we think it's just that, iterative. And that's actually why the organizations we spoke about earlier, and as Nadia and Chris were talking about, as Dwayne listed the ones that are out there, the lack of intellectual continuity somewhere in some small elite group in government to maintain the timing question is actually one of the structural flaws we think we have a disadvantage, namely with the PRC. So that's where a TCC, a very small function, not a big government move, just a small elite function of something near the action arm, like the Vice President's office that can do something with a sweep of a pen to say create Space Force. That's an analogy of how things get done and how you get past listing. Or the president to say, we were going to go to the moon and safely return the crew to Earth. Now, those are the kinds of things that can happen there to drive the whole innovation ecosystem to a place of advantage. But there's not that intellectual continuity that happens to judge the timing. So our basic argument would be, if you have a process, something like this, in a place that has an analytic and an action arm, so that's where we argue the Office of Global Competition Analysis, which Congress hasn't said where it would go, which is why we were careful about suggesting where it may go, because it's in draft legislation, would be the analytic arm. You might imagine something much like Chris's organization. It's a small, elite, analytic organization that stays like Andy Marshall stayed in the Pentagon for many years, right? These are public servants. We think of OMB as being one of these great examples where there are public servants there that are like the intellectual continuity of the United States on finance, but nobody knows that until you meet them. What would that look like for tech strategy? So that's like OCA. But then once they're done with the analytic and they keep that continuity together, you would share it with the action arm, which does change more fluidly with administrations as they do. So it's some marriage of the fact that there is this ephemeral dimension and there is this continuity dimension that we lack, and it's a systemic disadvantage in the United States. Let's just add one other thing on time, David, which is the USIP recommendation. One of the idea of having something where you can convene the private sector more easily. One of the things that amazes about USIP that everyone may not know is that they provide a lot of continuity briefs for administrations before they turn over. It's an objective source of advice. It's sort of seen as an objective organization, as difficult as that is to maintain in DC, to provide handover and continuity on foreign policy and other matters of peace. That's the piece that kind of caught our attention, right? Because then you can manage the timing aspects more detailed. And the final thing I would say is that planning never ends, right? So once a plan is committed to, like the moon in '62, that wasn't the only technology ambition that was happening at the time in the US, right? There was other decisions that were being made, albeit confidential, about tech moves we needed to make. So it is, in fact, as the word you used, I think, iterative. But if you have a process and a place that's very small and elite that could do this and convene the private sector the way NSC convenes the government sector, we think there's a way to manage time better than we do today.
And we're at time, so I'll be exceptionally brief on this one. So agree with that. The one thing I would add is we have to go into this recognizing that all of our plans have to be fluid and flexible. We can't be very rigid about how we go about this. It's going to be more, we're going in that direction rather than this is the plan.
Yeah, it seems like there's a time for both. And on this fluid example, we just produced a beta example plan for fusion energy. And we had met with a number of privateers and those in government, everywhere from ARPA-E, many other organizations. And one of the things is could you declare which is the path to fusion energy breakout? And in this case, what the plan declares is that we're not at that place yet, but you could still come up with a plan that would prepare the country for positional advantage, even if you don't declare that. So there's some marriage of when is it right to be detailed on the tech level and when is it right to lead space. So thank you so much for that question and for your interest, and thank you so much. Now we'll introduce Abigail, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dwayne and PJ, for bringing us further along and getting us more kind of siphoning down into from high level start to now more narrow, and then we're going to go into the tip of the spear with my colleague Abigail's presentation now. So Abigail Kakura is an Associate Director for Future Tech Platforms at SCSP, where she convenes actors across the innovation ecosystem to develop national action plans for key strategic technologies. Prior to SCSP, Abigail worked as a consultant on national security issues, and she previously worked at the Center for Strategic International Studies, CSIS. Abigail holds a BA in International Affairs from the George Washington University and an MA from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Without further ado, Abby.
Thanks, Will. Thank you to MITRE for partnering with us and hosting us here today. And thank you to all of you who are joining us here in person or tuning in virtually. We're really excited that you are interested in this topic and willing to dig into it with us this afternoon. So as we've been discussing this afternoon, we believe that the United States needs a national technology strategy process to position ourselves for the international techno-economic competition that we're in today. I'm going to dig deeper into the first part of that process, what we call the study function, the basic goal of which is to help the nation maintain awareness of where technology is going and the strategic implications of those technologies, as well as the relative positions of nations vis-a-vis those technologies. We see this as the key driver of this broader national technology strategy process, as it helps us answer those buckets of questions that PJ laid out about where technology is going, the state of the rival ecosystem, and the state of our own domestic ecosystem. We need to really pull from the entirety of our innovation ecosystem to do that well. And what we've found in our studies so far is that today we don't do that sufficiently, and particularly compared to our rival that does that in a more systematic way. As Chris said earlier, we need to figure out the American way of doing that and a model that does that well and aligns with our values and interests. So I'll talk a little bit first about what we see the study function looking like ideally in practice. I'll then share some lessons learned from our attempt to test drive or beta test this model over the past year. And I'll close with some challenges and opportunities that we see down the road that can hopefully be framing questions to prime our discussion in the working sessions that will follow. So what is the study function and what does it look like in practice? Essentially, we see it as a network that draws upon the existing talent in our innovation ecosystem. There are numerous organizations in government that have horizon scanning missions. Dwayne talked about a number of them today, everything from OSTP and NSTC to the national labs that are driving science and technology missions to the intelligence community, to GAO, to other strategy and budget missions in various departments and agencies. There's also an enormous well of largely untapped talent outside of government, from universities that are driving scientific and technological fields at the most emergent levels, to venture capitalists that are always scanning the horizon for their next big investment, to banks and consultancies that assess technology trends for their clients, think tanks and FFRDCs like MITRE that apply their expertise to technological problem sets, nonprofit communities that build groups of technologists, communities and build products like tech trees or roadmaps of where technology is going. Journalists, I'm sure you've seen dozens of tech trends lists over the past month, the end of the year, and even sci-fi authors and futurists are always trying to paint a picture for us of what technology might bring tomorrow. So the ecosystem is robust, and there is so much out there, but it's dispersed, and at present, we think there are insufficient lines of communication, particularly across the public and private sector. And importantly, no single organization is knitting this together with a national competitiveness lens and with the urgency of an international techno-economic competition. We see the study function and the larger process it feeds into as a way to help do that. So what does the study function look like in practice? We see it as a constellation of the types of horizon scanners I mentioned that are consistently and voluntarily sharing data and insights with a central hub, ideally within government, on technology trends and their strategic significance. There's a number of different models for what this could look like, but we essentially see the three functions being that they are constantly assessing the realm of the technologically possible across the full suite of technologies, constantly adding to that list of adding and subtracting from and reevaluating that list iteratively of which technologies are going to make the difference strategically for our nation. They're tracking the key players in that ecosystem across that innovation geometry. And they're helping to identify existing and potential technology gaps that could have implications for our national competitiveness, as well as potential band-aids or solutions or deeper solutions to those gaps that we see looking across our ecosystem. This all feeds into our ability to come up with action plans. The Horizon Network is the essential forum that is helping to feed insights into what would ultimately turn into a plan for the technologies that that group helps to identify. In terms of the value this type of organization would have, we see at least three key value adds. First, it's helping to close the gap between what we think is technologically possible and what is actually possible. There's often a difference between the two, and by pulling together the brightest minds at the cutting edge of technologies, we can raise the bar on what our nation can technologically achieve and what the bar-setting missions for various technology areas should be. It's also helping to connect dots across the innovation ecosystem amongst actors that may not otherwise cross paths. A venture capitalist investing in something, a student who's come up with a cutting edge solution to some scientific problem, a nonprofit that is solving some issue. They might not know one another exists, but could benefit from knowing about one another's existence and work. The internet can do a lot in that regard, but can't completely fill that. And it's also helping to just generally improve the situational awareness, especially within government, about where technology is going and what strategic technologies are not on our radar as much as they should be. We've talked a little bit already today about where this would live organizationally. We ideally see it within government someday, supporting the Technology Competitiveness Council. But for now, SCSP has been trying to beta test it from our 501c3 nonprofit capacity. So I'll turn now to a few lessons learned from the year we've spent trying to test drive this model. I think the first key lesson is that we really have validated our sense of the scope of horizon scanners that are out there in the ecosystem. A year ago, we started with a poster on a wall where we put sticky notes in a circle around who we thought was doing this horizon scanning. We joked that it was from banks to think tanks to automobile companies. And in the past year, we've validated that there really is as broad a range of perspectives and issue sets that people are working on in these areas. So the horizon scanning talent is vast. It was our first lesson. We've also, second lesson is that we have been really astounded by the willingness of those we've spoken with to put on a national lens hat, and think for the nation about the strategic implications of their technology area, even if that is not something that they are really structured or naturally incentivized to do. Many are willing to plug into this process. We've seen a few different reasons for that are often overlapping. The first is that many are actively looking for that sort of plug-in already. They've realized some of the implications of the trends that they're seeing, and they don't have a mechanism to share that information with government, but they would like one. Others see sort of an intrinsic interest in participating in such an organization. It can help them identify their own blind spots. It can help validate ideas that they've been toying with. It can help them better look across various technologies and see how technologies that aren't their key focus are helping to enable work that they're doing. And it can just generally improve their situational awareness about other actors in the ecosystem's priorities and efforts. It also serves as a forum to dialogue with government and other actors on adjacent issues like intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer, and the general regulatory and governance environment. The third lesson that we've learned is that there really are constraints and barriers to even those who are most eager to participate in such a network. So we're going to need to find flexibility in this model. A one-size-fits-all approach is not going to work, so we need to think creatively about how we can structure this organization in a way that incentivizes actors and organizations to contribute, but also recognizes the barriers and puts in place creative solutions to sort of mitigate some of the constraints around sharing information, data, participation, et cetera. So what we'll focus on mostly in the working session is that last issue of how do we make this a flexible model and structure the mechanics in the right way that the broadest set of horizon scanners can contribute to it and actively participate in it. So before we stress test those ideas in the working session, I'll leave you with sort of 4 key themes that we hope to cover there to turn this into a sustainable long-term network that, while currently SCSP is test driving, could ultimately one day transition into government. So those key components are, first, the incentives for contributing to such a network. We've seen a number of different motivations for actors wanting to participate. For some, it's civic duty and a sense of patriotism. For many, it's legitimate business interests. And for others, it's a recognition of the stakes of the competition through their own work. They've realized that this matters for their work and for the nation. We need your help today and moving forward to better bound those incentives and understand how they shape different actors' participation so that we can structure the organization to capture the widest range possible. At the same time, we need to understand the barriers to participation, as I mentioned. We need to figure out creative ways to mitigate concerns like intellectual property, proprietary information, business sensitivities, the reality that people might have to, or this might turn into a situation where someone's in the room with their business competitor. How do we navigate that? How do we proactively think about that and figure out ways that they are willing to do that? Third is the information sharing dynamics. We've already started to explore what those might look like with a nonprofit organization like SCSP running such a network, but we need to equally think about how those might change if this organization were to be situated within government. So would like your help sort of thinking through some creative ideas we've already been thinking about, but also things that might not have crossed our mind yet that you all have deep expertise or ideas about. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, is the mechanics and logistics for how to pull this off and do it in a way that's ultimately sustainable and productive for everyone involved. This is a voluntary network of people who have many demands on their time. So how do we strike the right balance of engaging enough that we can keep pace with technology that is evolving rapidly, but not overburden or oversaturate any participants? And how do we effectively group people in the network so that we can look both across technologies, but also dive deep into a specific technology area? So those are the 4 priming thoughts for the sessions moving forward: incentives, barriers, information sharing dynamics, and mechanics. And I'll turn it over to Mike in just a second here, but just wanted to say that we're so excited to learn from all of you and your expertise. You are all the experts in this, and both today, this afternoon, and moving forward. We're going to need your help moving this from the phase one crank on this machine that we've been test driving the past year to turn it into something that is sustainable long-term and really reflects the insights across the whole ecosystem. So we're really excited that you're here with us today to dig into these issues and excited to see what more we can do moving forward together. Thanks.
Thank you, Abby. So this concludes our plenary session for the afternoon. And the first thing I'd like to do is thank our speakers. I'd also like to give a special thank you to our virtual plenary audience for joining us today. And those that have joined us online, if you have thoughts or desires to engage further on any of the content discussed here in the room this afternoon, please email policy@mitre.org.